In 1936, one ship crossing the Atlantic controlled the prestige of an entire empire. Walk into any first-class lounge from Southampton to New York, and there was only one name people wanted stamped on their luggage tags: Queen Mary. She was the fastest liner on Earth. She held the blue Riband for 14 years. She carried Winston Churchill to war, Hollywood stars to premieres, and refugees to freedom. At her peak, this ship ran at 30 knots, nearly twice the speed of her predecessors. He employed 1,100 crew members and generated millions in revenue while carrying 2.1 million passengers across 3.7 million miles of open ocean. A ship so dominant that when you said crossing the Atlantic, people assumed you meant on the Queen Mary. Then something went catastrophically wrong. Music. By 1967, those same decks sat empty. The passengers were gone, the engines fell silent, and within 8 months, the ship that had survived the Great Depression, World War II, and the sinking of a British cruiser would be sold for scrap metal prices and towed to California 6,000 miles from the ocean she was born to rule. Her market share collapsed from dominance to irrelevance, drowning not in water but in a new reality. The Boeing 707 could cross the Atlantic in 7 hours. The Queen Mary took 5 days. This is the story of how one shipping company turned British national pride into the greatest ocean liner ever built. How speed and luxury created a floating empire that seemed unstoppable. And how that same empire made a series of decisions so arrogant and short-sighted that it was rendered obsolete in less than 2 decades, not by a better ship, but by a machine that didn't even touch the water. Music. This isn't just about old ocean liners gathering rust in harbors. This is about the price of ignoring technological revolutions, the danger of building your identity around a single product, and what happens when the highway you dominate ceases to be the highway at all. Welcome inside the Queen Mary, where Britain's industrial dream ruled the Atlantic, and then discovered the Atlantic didn't matter anymore. Chapter 1. The War That Built Her. Industrial empires aren't born from ambition alone. They are forged in the cold furnace of competition and national humiliation. To understand why Britain built the Queen Mary, you have to understand what it felt like to lose. In 1929, the RMS Mauretania, Cunard Line's aging champion, finally lost the blue Riband to Germany's Bremen. For 2 decades, Cunard had ruled the Atlantic with the Mauretania and her sister Lusitania. But the Lusitania had been torpedoed by a German U-boat in 1915, taking 1,198 souls to the bottom of the Irish Sea. The Mauretania was old, slow, and living on borrowed prestige. The Bremen was new, fast, and terrifyingly efficient. She represented everything Britain feared about Germany: modern, ruthless, and unbeatable. Then France struck. In 1935, the SS Normandy took the blue Riband from Bremen. She wasn't just fast, she was a floating palace. An Art Deco masterpiece that made every other ship look like a cargo barge. Her first-class dining room was longer than the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. Her grand salon could host 400 people beneath a ceiling of hammered gold. The British looked at the Normandy and saw their own obsolescence reflected in polished bronze. But Britain had a bigger problem than hurt pride. The country was broke. The Great Depression had gutted the shipbuilding industry. Unemployment in Clydebank, Scotland, where the Queen Mary would be built, was over 70%. Families were starving. The project had started in 1930 under the designation Hull 534. But by December 1931, the money ran out. The hull sat incomplete on the slipway, a 35,000-ton skeleton of riveted steel, rusting in the Scottish rain, a monument to British failure visible from miles away. For 2.5 years, she sat, silent, abandoned. 3,000 shipyard workers were laid off. Clydebank turned into a ghost town, its entire economy waiting for a miracle that seemed never to arrive. Then, in 1934, the British government made a decision that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with survival. They would finish Hull 534. Not because it was profitable, it wasn't. Not because it made strategic sense, it didn't. But because Britain needed to prove to itself and to the world that it could still build something great. The government provided a £9.5 million loan to Cunard on one brutal condition. Cunard had to merge with its dying rival, White Star Line, and create a single, unified British transatlantic fleet. The marriage was forced. The money flowed. And on the 26th of September, 1934, King George V and Queen Mary arrived at Clydebank to launch the hull. The king was supposed to announce the ship's name. The crowd expected Victoria, but the king turned to his wife and said, "I am happy to name this ship after Britain's greatest queen." He meant Queen Mary. Standing right next to him. No one corrected him. The ship became the Queen Mary. And Britain had its weapon. Chapter 2. Built for war, sold as luxury. Great ships are not designed by committees. They are designed by obsessives with a singular, uncompromising vision. The Queen Mary's naval architect was Sir Thomas Bell, a man who believed that a ship's purpose was not to float gracefully, but to dominate violently. Bell understood the brutal mathematics of speed. To move a hull through water at 30 knots required exponentially more power than moving it at 20 knots. The water itself became the enemy, resisting with a force that increased geometrically with every additional knot. To win that war, Bell designed the Queen Mary with 4 Parsons steam turbines, each driving a single bronze propeller. Together, they generated 160,000 shaft horsepower. That was the power of 3,200 automobiles, all screaming at once, pushing a single hull through the ocean. The propellers themselves were engineering marvels. Each weighed 35 tons and measured 18 feet in diameter. They were so finely balanced that a single ounce of imbalance would destroy the shaft at full speed. But power demanded fuel. Obscene amounts of fuel. The Queen Mary consumed 1,000 tons of fuel oil every single day at maximum speed. Over a typical 5-day Atlantic crossing, she would burn through 5,000 tons, nearly 6% of her total displacement. She wasn't a ship. She was a controlled explosion, a floating furnace that moved at 35 miles per hour across 3,000 miles of open ocean. The interior design was weaponized luxury. The first-class dining room could seat 800 passengers beneath a ceiling of carved English oak. The walls were paneled in rare bur elm, a wood so expensive it had to be harvested from private estates. The grand staircase was a 3-story descent into opulence. Bronze balustrades, hand-carved maple panels, and a carpet so thick you could lose a wedding ring in it. But this was not luxury for luxury's sake. This was architecture as propaganda. Every detail was designed to convince the passenger that Britain was still the center of the world, that crossing the Atlantic on a British ship was not just transportation, but a statement of allegiance to an empire that, despite economic collapse, despite losing its dominance, despite everything, could still build the most beautiful floating object on Earth. Yet beneath the luxury was a secret written into every blueprint. The Queen Mary was designed, from the first rivet, to be converted into a troop ship. Her watertight compartments could seal in seconds. Her fuel tanks were arranged for maximum stability even when half empty. Her decks were reinforced to carry artillery. The British Admiralty had subsidized her construction on one condition. In the event of war, she would become His Majesty's troop ship Queen Mary. The passengers dining on bone, china, and crystal had no idea they were eating in a future warship. The workers riveting her hull didn't know they were building a weapon. They just knew they had jobs again. And they worked with the desperate precision of men who understood that failure was starvation. Chapter 3. The Beast Awakens. Building the Queen Mary was not construction. It was industrial warfare on a scale that defied comprehension. The John Brown shipyard in Clydebank had to redesign its entire infrastructure just to accommodate her. The slipway was extended 200 feet. The cranes were reinforced to lift steel plates weighing 10 tons each. And on the 27th of December 1930, the first keel plate was laid. What followed was 4 years of controlled chaos. Over 10 million rivets were driven into her hull. Each rivet had to be heated to white hot in a portable furnace, caught with tongs, placed in the hole, and hammered flat with a pneumatic gun that sounded like continuous thunder. The rivet gangs worked in teams of 4, moving with mechanical precision. Heat the rivet, catch it, place it, hammer it, repeat, 10 million times. The noise was inhuman. The heat was unbearable. Men fell from scaffolding 80 feet above the ground. They were crushed by steel plates swinging from cranes. They were burned by molten metal. The official death toll was never released, but workers whispered that at least 30 men died during construction. Their names were not engraved on the ship. There was no memorial. They were simply the cost of empire. By September 1934, the hull was complete. She sat on the slipway, a massive wall of gray steel, waiting for the launch. Over 200,000 people gathered on the banks of the Clyde to watch. Queen Mary's champagne bottle, specially reinforced to ensure it would break, swung against the bow and shattered on the first impact. The hydraulic triggers released. The Queen Mary began to slide. She weighed 35,000 tons. She accelerated down the greased slipway, displacing a wave so massive it flooded the opposite bank and damaged buildings half a mile away. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the hull hit the water with a roar like a collapsing mountain. She floated. Britain exhaled, but floating was only the beginning. For the next 18 months, the hull was fitted out with the guts of a floating city. The turbines were lowered into the engine room by cranes so large they had to be specially built for this single job. The electrical system capable of powering 50,000 homes was threaded through her decks. The plumbing could deliver 4,000 gallons of fresh water per minute. The kitchens could prepare 10,000 meals a day. And on the 27th of May 1936, she was ready. Not just a ship, a statement, a weapon disguised as a palace. The Atlantic had a new queen, and she was British. Chapter 4. The Golden Crossing. On August 1936, 4 months after her maiden voyage, the Queen Mary did what she was built to do. She broke the world. The westbound crossing from Southampton to New York took 4 days and 27 minutes at an average speed of 30.14 knots. It wasn't just fast. It was violently, impossibly fast for a ship her size. The Normandy was elegant. The Queen Mary was brutal. She didn't glide across the Atlantic. She attacked it with 160,000 horsepower of sustained fury. The blue riband was hers. And for the next 14 years, she would defend it like a heavyweight champion, losing it only briefly to the Normandy before reclaiming it in 1938. But speed was only part of the story. The real magic was who wanted to cross on her. The passenger lists read like a catalog of the 20th century's most powerful people. Winston Churchill crossed multiple times, treating the Queen Mary as his mobile office during wartime negotiations. Clark Gable boarded in dark sunglasses, trying to avoid photographers. Elizabeth Taylor honeymooned in a first-class stateroom with Conrad Hilton. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor, exiled British royalty, used the ship as their floating palace, crossing the Atlantic as if they still ruled an empire. To cross on the Queen Mary was to announce your relevance. The passenger list was published in newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic, and people scanned the names like they were reading the social register. If your name appeared in the Queen Mary's first-class manifest, you mattered. Businessmen networked in the smoking room, a cathedral of Australian walnut paneling and leather chairs so deep you could disappear into them. Deals worth millions were struck over whiskey and Cuban cigars, sealed with handshakes beneath oil paintings of British naval victories. The smoking room wasn't just a lounge, it was a floating boardroom where the architecture of global commerce was quietly redesigned. Debutantes posed on the promenade deck in fur coats and pearls, photographers capturing them against the backdrop of endless ocean. These photos would appear in society pages from London to Los Angeles, announcing that these young women had officially entered the world that mattered. The promenade deck was a stage, and everyone aboard knew they were performing. Honeymooners disappeared into first-class staterooms designed with a British understanding of discretion and privacy. These weren't just bedrooms, they were sanctuaries of carved wood, silk wallpaper, and private bathrooms with hot running water that never stopped flowing. Couples emerged 5 days later in New York, transformed not just by luxury, but by the peculiar intimacy of being suspended between continents, untethered from the ordinary world. The ship became a character in films, novels, and tabloid gossip. When a wealthy passenger suffered a fatal heart attack mid-crossing in 1937, the body was stored in the ship's refrigerated cargo hold until arrival, and the story was suppressed to avoid disturbing other guests. When a second-class passenger gave birth in 1938, the baby was granted British citizenship, born in British territorial waters, technically aboard a floating piece of the empire itself. But beneath the champagne and caviar, beneath the performances and the prestige, the Queen Mary was a machine, and machines require constant, brutal maintenance. After each crossing, the crew had 48 hours to clean, repair, and restock before the next departure. The laundry processed 50,000 pieces of linen per voyage. The kitchen restocked 10 tons of food, including 5,000 eggs, 2,000 pounds of meat, and enough alcohol to intoxicate a small army. The engine room inspected every turbine blade, every boiler tube, every bearing. The ship was not a luxury liner. She was an industrial operation disguised as a hotel, running on a knife edge between perfection and catastrophic failure. And she was profitable. In 1938, the Queen Mary carried 39,000 passengers and generated £3 million in revenue. For the first time in a decade, Cunard was making money. The ship had paid for herself. The gamble had worked. But in September 1939, the world caught fire, and the Queen Mary's purpose changed overnight. Chapter 5. The Grey Ghost. On the 3rd of September 1939, Britain declared war on Germany. The Queen Mary was in New York, preparing for her return crossing. The British government sent an urgent cable. Do not return. Stay in New York. Wait for orders. For 6 months, she sat idle at Pier 90 inches Manhattan, her engines cold, consuming money, but generating none. Then, in March 1940, the orders came. The Queen Mary would be converted into a troopship. The transformation was brutal and efficient. The Art Deco furniture was ripped out and stored in warehouses. The wood paneling was stripped to reduce fire risk. The grand staircase remained, but the surrounding lounges were gutted and replaced with bunks. Thousands of bunks, stacked 3 high, packed so tightly that soldiers slept in shifts. She was painted battleship gray. Her name was removed. She became HMT Queen Mary, His Majesty's troopship. At first, she carried troops from Australia to the Middle East, sailing alone at 30 knots, zigzagging constantly to evade U-boats. A convoy moved at the speed of its slowest ship, usually 12 knots. The Queen Mary didn't need protection. She was faster than any submarine, faster than most destroyers. The strategy was simple: run at full speed and pray the torpedoes missed. In 1942, she was reassigned to the North Atlantic, carrying American troops to Europe. This was the most dangerous route in the world, infested with German wolf packs. But the Queen Mary ran alone, carrying 16,000 soldiers at a time, 10 times her peacetime capacity. The soldiers slept in shifts. There weren't enough bunks, toilets, or food. Men slept on deck, in lifeboats, in corridors. The voyage took 7 days of constant terror. They ate twice a day standing up, in mess lines that stretched the length of the ship. The latrines overflowed within hours of departure, and the smell became so unbearable that soldiers preferred to relieve themselves off the stern rather than venture below decks. The heat was suffocating. 16,000 men generated body heat equivalent to a massive furnace. The ventilation systems, designed for 2,000 peacetime passengers, collapsed under the load. In the lower decks, temperatures reached 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Men passed out. Some never woke up. The air below decks was a toxic fog of sweat, vomit, diesel fumes, and fear. Soldiers who had survived boot camp, who thought they'd seen hardship, discovered new definitions of misery. Some wrote letters home describing the crossing as worse than combat. At least in combat, they said, you could see the enemy. But the Queen Mary's greatest weapon was her invisibility through speed. German U-boat commanders received standing orders. If you spot the Queen Mary, do not engage. She's too fast. Save your torpedoes for targets you can hit. The psychological effect was devastating. The British had built a ship the Germans were ordered to avoid. The crew worked in conditions that defied human endurance. The engine room, always hot, became a vision of hell. The boilers consumed fuel at maximum rate for 7 days straight. The firemen stripped to the waist, covered in soot, shoveled coal, and monitored gauges in 140-degree heat. They worked 4-hour shifts, emerged barely conscious, and returned 4 hours later to do it again. But the Queen Mary was fast, and speed was survival. On the 2nd of October 1942, disaster struck. Off the coast of Ireland, the Queen Mary was being escorted by the cruiser HMS Curacoa. The two ships were zigzagging in coordinated patterns, but the Curacoa misjudged the Queen Mary's speed. She turned directly into the liner's path. The Queen Mary's bow, reinforced for ramming, sliced through the Curacoa like a knife through paper. The cruiser was cut in half. She sank in 6 minutes. 338 men died. The Queen Mary's captain received an order from the Admiralty. Do not stop. Do not rescue survivors. Continue to port. The Queen Mary had 16,000 soldiers aboard. The Admiralty decided that 16,000 lives outweighed 338. The liner sailed on. Most of the Curacoa's crew drowned. By the end of the war, the Queen Mary had carried over 800,000 soldiers, more than any ship in history. Winston Churchill called her the ship that won the war. But she was broken. Her engines were worn. Her hull was battered. In 1946, she returned to Clydebank for a £3 million refit. The gray paint was stripped. The bunks were removed. The Queen Mary was returning to civilian service. But the world she returned to was not the world she had left. Chapter 6. The Jet Age Kills the Ocean. The 1950s were supposed to be the Queen Mary's second golden age, and for a brief moment they were. The crossings were full. The bars were crowded. The rich returned, eager to reclaim the rituals of pre-war luxury. Cunard marketed her as the world's favorite ship, and for a few years it was true. But something fundamental had changed. The passengers were different. Many were Americans, flush with post-war prosperity, treating the crossing as a vacation rather than transportation. They didn't care about the blue riband. They cared about convenience. And the Queen Mary, for all her speed, was not convenient. 5 days at sea, no phone calls, no flexibility. If you missed the departure, you waited a week. Still, the ship endured. In 1952, air conditioning was added to first-class cabins. In 1958, she carried her 2 millionth passenger amid great fanfare. But the cracks were showing. The passenger demographics were changing in ways Cunard couldn't control. The old money, the industrial barons, the titled aristocracy, the families who had crossed for generations were aging out or dying off. Their children and grandchildren didn't care about the Queen Mary's history. They cared about their time. The new rich tech entrepreneurs, real estate developers, entertainment executives measured time differently. 5 days at sea wasn't romantic. It was wasted productivity. They needed to be in London tomorrow, not next week. The ocean crossing had transformed from a symbol of sophistication into a symbol of inefficiency. Even worse, the middle class that had briefly filled the cabin-class accommodations during the post-war boom was discovering that transatlantic jet travel was becoming affordable. Pan Am, TWA, and BOAC were locked in a price war, driving fares down every quarter. By 1960, you could fly from New York to London for $300 round trip. A cabin-class berth on the Queen Mary cost $350 and took 10 days round trip. The mathematics were brutal and irreversible. The real threat was not another ship. It was the sky. On the 4th of October, 1958, British Overseas Airways Corporation launched the first transatlantic jet service using the de Havilland Comet 4, London to New York, in 10 hours. The Queen Mary took 5 days. The price was comparable. The choice was obvious. Cunard tried to fight back. They lowered prices. They marketed the crossing as half the fun. But the rich didn't want fun. They wanted speed. And the middle class couldn't afford luxury. The passenger numbers collapsed. In 1957, more people crossed the Atlantic by air than by sea. By 1965, the ratio was 4 to 1 in favor of jets. The Queen Mary's crossings became half empty. The dining rooms echoed. In 1966, Cunard made the final decision. The Queen Mary would be retired. She had been in service for 31 years. She had carried 2.1 million passengers. She had sailed 3.7 million miles. She had survived a war, a collision, and countless storms. But she could not survive the Boeing 707. Chapter 7. The Long Beach Exile. On the 22nd of September, 1967, the Queen Mary left Southampton on her final crossing. The passenger list was full, not because people wanted to cross the Atlantic, but because they wanted to say goodbye. The mood was elegiac. Elderly couples who had crossed on her in the 1930s wandered the decks, weeping quietly. Journalists documented every detail. The crew wore black armbands. On the final night, the first-class dining room was full. The orchestra played. The passengers danced. But it felt like a funeral. At midnight, the captain announced that the Queen Mary had completed her 1001st Atlantic crossing. There would not be a 1002nd. She arrived in New York on the 27th of September, 1967, to a harbor filled with fireboats and helicopters. Then, on October 31, she left for the last time, not back to Southampton, but west. Through the Panama Canal, around Cape Horn, up the Pacific coast to Long Beach, California, a journey of 14,500 miles, the longest voyage of her life and the slowest. On the 9th of December 1967, the Queen Mary arrived in Long Beach. Her engines shut down for the final time. The steam pressure dropped. The turbines stopped. The silence was absolute. The city of Long Beach had purchased her for $3.45 million, less than 6% of her construction cost, with a plan to convert her into a hotel and tourist attraction. The conversion cost $70 million, 20 times the purchase price. It didn't work. The ship's interiors, designed for motion, didn't translate to a stationary hotel. The rooms were small, the corridors narrow, guests complained, bookings were low. And the maintenance costs were staggering. Every year, the Queen Mary required millions in repairs. The hull corroded, the decks rotted, the city lost money every year. In 1993, Disney leased the ship and invested $160 million in renovations. The project failed. Disney pulled out in 1996. By 2015, a city engineering report found that the Queen Mary needed $300 million in urgent repairs just to remain structurally sound. The city didn't have $300 million. Today, she sits in Long Beach, rusting. The hotel is open, but occupancy is low. The tours continue, but crowds are thin. The city loses $5 million per year. There is talk of selling her, talk of scrapping her, talk of converting her into condominiums. But mostly, there is silence. Chapter 8. The Lessons. The rise and fall of the Queen Mary teaches us 3 brutal lessons about industrial power, technological change, and the danger of building monuments to fleeting eras. Lesson 1. Prestige is not a business model. The Queen Mary was built not to make money, but to make a statement. Britain needed to prove it could still compete with Germany and France. The ship was subsidized by the government and designed to be the biggest, fastest, most luxurious liner on Earth. And she was. But luxury doesn't guarantee profit. The Queen Mary was profitable for only 10 of her 31 years in civilian service. The rest of the time, she was at war, in refit, or struggling to fill her cabins. The ship that was supposed to save Cunard became a financial burden. National pride is a terrible foundation for business. Lesson 2. You cannot legislate against obsolescence. When jets began dominating transatlantic travel, the shipping industry fought back. Cunard lobbied governments to restrict airline competition. They proposed higher landing fees. They argued that ocean liners were strategic national assets. None of it worked. The market didn't care about tradition. Passengers didn't care about romance. They cared about time. 7 hours by air versus 5 days by sea. The choice was obvious. The Queen Mary was not defeated by a better ship. She was defeated by a different technology, and no amount of lobbying could change that. Lesson 3. Preservation requires purpose. The Queen Mary was saved from the scrapyard because people believed she was worth preserving. And she was a work of art, a piece of history, a testament to human engineering. But preservation is expensive. The Queen Mary costs millions per year to maintain. Long Beach has spent over $500 million since 1967. For what? A half-empty hotel? A struggling museum? The problem is simple. The Queen Mary has no purpose. She cannot sail. She is not a viable hotel. She is a museum that doesn't generate revenue. Nostalgia is not a business plan. Epilogue. The ghost on the wrong ocean. Today, if you visit Long Beach, you will see her, 1,019 feet of riveted steel, sitting in a harbor 6,000 miles from home. The Queen Mary was built to cut through Atlantic waves at 30 knots, her bow slamming into swells that would destroy smaller vessels, her turbines screaming with 160,000 horsepower of controlled violence. She sits motionless in the Pacific, her propellers frozen in California mud, her engines cold and silent. She was designed to carry dukes and starlets between continents, to be the floating bridge between the old world and the new, the vessel that transported not just bodies but identities, ambitions, and dreams. Now she hosts middle school field trips and paranormal investigators who claim the ship is haunted by spirits of soldiers who died aboard during the war. Maybe she is haunted, not by ghosts, but by the memory of what she represented, a world where crossing the ocean meant something, where 5 days at sea was not wasted time but the price of admission to a different civilization, where the journey itself was a ritual of transformation. An arrival in New York or Southampton carried the weight of genuine accomplishment. That world is gone. Erased not by war or disaster, but by technology that made it irrelevant. The Atlantic is crossed in 7 hours now by people who barely notice they've left the ground. They board in London, watch a movie, eat a meal, and disembark in New York without ever feeling the motion of their passage. The ocean has become invisible, something to fly over rather than through. The romance is dead because the challenge is dead. The Queen Mary survived the Great Depression, when nations collapsed and currencies became worthless. She survived World War II, when the world tore itself apart and millions died. She survived the collision that killed 338 British sailors, her bow crumpled but her will unbroken. But she could not survive the jet engine. She could not survive the invention of a machine that made the ocean obsolete. And so she sits, rusting, fading, bleeding money, a monument to the dangerous idea that what we build to last forever rarely does. That dominance in one era is no guarantee of relevance in the next. That the highway you control can cease to be the highway. The tours continue. Tourists wander her decks, taking selfies in front of Art Deco fixtures, sleeping in rooms that once hosted the most powerful people on Earth. But they don't understand. They can't, because they've never lived in a world where this ship mattered, where seeing her smokestacks on the horizon meant connection, meant arrival, meant the difference between isolation and civilization. Long Beach loses $5 million per year, keeping her afloat. Politicians debate her future in city council meetings. Sell her? To whom? Scrap her? Unthinkable. Preserve her? For how long and at what cost? There are no good answers, only the slow, inevitable decay of a monument that outlived its purpose. The ocean remembers. The Atlantic still moves, cold and relentless, indifferent to the ships that once claimed to rule it. The Queen Mary ruled for 31 years. And then, one day, the world moved on. But if you stand on the pier in Long Beach, on a quiet morning, before the tourists arrive, and look at her hull, 1,019 feet of riveted steel, still strong, still defiant, You can imagine what it must have felt like in 1936 to watch her slide into the Clyde for the first time. To see her smokestacks rise above the Scottish hills. To know that Britain had built something that could not be ignored. To believe, even for a moment, that speed and power and luxury could hold back the future. She was not just a ship. She was a declaration, a steel anthem, a floating empire, and now she is a ghost on the wrong ocean, forever docked, forever silent, forever waiting for a tide that will never come.